Starting now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Road to Dubai briefing. This is a chance to get an idea of what we are hearing in terms of policy priorities, what's happening in terms of advocacy campaigns, what's happening in Dubai on actual campaigning, and then some of the key messages that we are looking to push and have heard around COP. We have an excellent panel with us today. We have Frederica Roeder from Global Citizen, and we have Megan Abram from CESR, who will be giving a bit of a policy update. They will then have a conversation on the campaigns, advocacy, and messaging. And we have Sophia Richmond, we have Andrew Nazin and Mir from GSCC, who will be sharing some of their thoughts on that part of the work. If you'd like to ask a question during this, please put your questions into the chat. What we'll do is we'll then when we open questions, we'll just take them as they've been put into the chat. If we have lots of questions, we will bunch them, but otherwise I'll go to the person who's asked the question, ask them to ask it live. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Frederica Roeder from Global Citizen to give us a bit of an overview on the policy priorities coming forward for COP28. So Frederica, take it away.
Thanks so much, Cal, and good morning, good afternoon to you all. So let me share my screen. Actually, it's disabled on my end.
Oh,
Cal.
Apologize for that. Have I not made you a co-host? Oh, there we go. I'll make you co-host now. Apologize for that.
No worries at all.
There we go.
Great. You can see it, right?
We can.
Okay, amazing. So I'll kick it off. But as Cal already said, we have actually great panelists joining us today, and Meghna will also dive in a little bit deeper in some of the policy issues that I might already touch on in my presentation. And I actually also see that some experts are online, so also looking forward to the discussion with all of you. So first of all, I try to have a little bit of an overview of where we actually stand in terms of climate finance. So first of all, obviously, when let's say in the general public, when we talk about climate finance, I think the first thing people think about is the 100 billion US dollars. So something that was actually agreed back in 2009, so now 14 years ago. Should have been met in 2020, which was actually already a delayed timeline. Wasn't met. And what we found out a few days ago, so we were eagerly awaiting a new report from the OECD on climate finance. And they actually now put out the figures for 2021. Unfortunately, and we already kind of knew it, is that the 100 billion were not met in 2021, so 1 year late. So the figure is actually 89.6 billion. And I'm not even going into methodological questions, but this is the data we have from the OECD. And then they also had this interesting sentence which says, based on preliminary and as yet unverified data, the goal looks likely to have already been met as of 2022. So here, what I would say is we don't have the data. And so at this stage, we cannot say that the 100 billion have been met in 2022. And I think this is maybe one thing that is a real problem, apart from the fact that a long-standing promise hasn't been met. And is that actually the data is missing to be able to say what wealthy countries did or did not do. And what I should also say is that most of you know this is a goal that is actually meant to, it's an annual one through to 2025. So the question is, there is now a gap, we know for sure, in 2020 and 2021, probably also in 2022, or chances are. And then the question is also obviously what is happening between 2023 and 2025. Then on to adaptation. So here again, we do have some data from the OECD, but there's also a new UNEP report on this. So there are different figures out here. I think here the worrying signal is that not only has the adaptation goal hasn't been met, so that was 40 billion out of the 100 billion, which is actually already a revised down goal, because initially the objective was to actually have a equal split between adaptation and mitigation in the 100 billion. But the really worrying signal we're getting out of the different reports that came out, that there's been actually a drop in financing for adaptation. So while needs are increasing, what we see is that adaptation is less funded than in the past. So the OECD report says 14%, others are actually even seeing a bigger drop. Then since last year, this came at the forefront of the COP agenda, and luckily or fortunately so, loss and damage financing, where there was a historic breakthrough last year, but the real work basically has started now with the transitional committee. I'm not going more into detail of the compromise that will be tabled at COP and might still change, obviously. But here, I think the big question is, apart from actually coming up with a fund and financing mechanisms, is how do we fund loss and damage? And here again, I mean, there are lots of estimates out there, but we're talking hundreds of billions per year. And I think what is important here to note as well is the quality of financing, and in particular for loss and damage, what this requires is grant financing. And then there's been obviously a lot of talk about other types of financing. And one thing that will probably also come up at COP are the special drawing rights. I think important here, and also in light of what's been said, for instance, by the IMF at the Paris summit, or also some governments, the goal here was, again, $100 billion in SDRs reallocated from wealthy countries to countries in need, in particular for the green transition. But so far, only 87 billion have been pledged. I'm excluding here the US pledge because it's stuck in Congress, and there's not much. I mean, there's the chances of this being actually dispersed in the next year are very slim. So I don't think it's fair actually to include it. So we're actually below the 100 billion. And I think what's important to note here as well is that only 1 billion, or less than actually 1 billion, have been dispersed and have arrived in countries in need. It's not to say that special drawing rights are not an interesting means and that we can probably maximize their impact, but they're not the panacea they might be portrayed as. Here I just added, so I already mentioned the fact that we don't have actually good data on climate finance. There are lots of different data sets out there, and also the question of how you actually calculate the fair share, what exactly you include, and so on. One study is the ODI one, which was actually recently updated, including adaptation financing. And I just put it in here. I must say there are some figures which we wouldn't take the same ones, but the question, for instance, of how you count MDB financing, non-concessional financing, and so on. But I think the bottom line of any methodology and data set you're looking at is that we're not there. And I think that the countries that are particularly lagging behind are also pretty similar. So you see on the left-hand side, you see the ranking ODI did for the 100 billion in total, and on the right-hand side, the one in particular for adaptation financing. It's broadly the same countries that are doing particularly bad, but it's not to say that those that actually are in the green category shouldn't be doing more. So for instance, if we pick out Germany, we know that at the moment they're actually cutting the budget and are not actually at their own, they're not reaching their own target on climate finance. So what should happen at COP? So that is obviously one thing that I'm particularly eager to discuss with you today. So on the 100 billion and also as part of the 100 billion, the adaptation financing. So will we see more transparency? So I told you that the OECD report just came out, and we're also expecting through the for the EU to publish a report before COP detailing the contributions from EU member states and from the Commission, and that would use 2022 data, so that would be very much welcome. And actually also hopefully other countries actually will publish data that they haven't published so far. So for instance, for the US, we know that they have the data ready, but it hasn't been published. So one thing is definitely more transparency. Maybe I'm putting it in red at the moment, but more pledges, because I said it's not only about have we met the 100 billion in 2022 or 2023, it's also looking forward, obviously, to what's happening in 2024 and 2025. I'm not going into the discussions for the new collective quantified goal, but you know that this is also happening. So what's happening basically after 2025? How do we assess needs and how do we ensure that actually future goals are being met and it's not the same drama as we've seen around the 100 billion? And in particular, there's also an adaptation framework to being discussed. Same thing, I think it's not just about setting the right targets, identifying needs, but also the whole question of how do we make sure that actually new targets, new goals will be met and that we are not in the same situation as we have been with the 100 billion over the last few years. So on loss and damage, I already spoke about the compromise that might be changed. So that is more about the funding channels, but the big question is what is going into the funding channels. Here, what we know is that the EU will come up with a joint pledge. We don't know the amount yet, so it will be a mix of the Commission and EU member states, maybe other regions, other countries. While this is certainly welcome, obviously it's not the solution, especially longer term. I mentioned special drawing rights. Here, I think the next and most urgent challenge is actually to get to improve the mechanisms we have to use SDRs. So for the time being, we do have 2 IMF funds, but it's not sufficient and it's slow. So one possibility would be to use a new mechanism that the African Development Bank has developed. And there will be a high-level event here on the 4th of December. Hopefully, this could be the moment where this mechanism is finally actually put into operations. So what this requires is actually 5 countries that step up to say that they will support this mechanism with their special drawing rights. But I would say at this stage, as you see, I put it in orangey yellow. We're not sure whether we're able actually to find enough countries willing to step up and to use this new mechanism. There are other things that could happen on MDB reforms and so on. I'm not going into detail because I don't think that they will significantly move the needle, but maybe others have other views on this. Last but not least, and I know Meghna will also talk about it, and we have others here online that are very much involved in this, is that there will be the launch of a new task force looking into international taxes that could fund mitigation, adaptation, and in particular loss and damage, but also potentially other issues. This is led by Kenya and France. I think here it's great to see this happening. Important is that there's a real process. It's not just about talking about options, but actually leading to an implementation of one or even several taxes. I think also very important, obviously, this all needs to be additional funding to the 100 billion, to what we need on adaptation, and shouldn't come at the detriment of other financing sources. Last but not least, I just want to leave you with 2 graphs, because I think and I think this will be a very important message at COP, is that climate finance is obviously key for the fight against climate change, in particular financing that can actually be used by by particularly poor and vulnerable countries and also highly indebted countries. I think given that the figures we have for the needs are just, I mean, mind-boggling, right? We're talking hundreds of billions, if not trillions. I think it's important to remind everyone that actually money is not the problem, it's there. It just needs to be rechanneled. So one thing is obviously fossil fuel subsidies. And here you see how, I mean, they were actually, I mean, they're meant to be phased out. You see that they increased significantly. And this includes subsidies for production, not just for consumption. I think that's important to note. And then one graph, maybe Mia is going to talk more about this, is actually what the global oil and gas industry made in 2022 compared to, for instance, what Pakistan needed after the floods. Just to put this into perspective, so money is there. And I think lots of solutions are on the table, but what we need is political will. Back to you, Kel.
Quite a startling statistic to leave us on, but shows us the potential out there. I want to quickly now go to Meganana Abrams from CESR to give us a bit more detail on some of the policy updates you just shared.
Thanks very much, Kel. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so so I mean, I think Frederick has given a very comprehensive overview, and I'm going to try and be brief because I know there are other panelists and we wanted to have time for discussion. I'm very proud of myself because I did this myself, this graphic this morning, and I thought for me it sort of captures actually really if we zoom out, and I think that is one of the things I should start off by saying. So I'm not one of the major sort of experts on the COP who's been there and done lots of stuff. I come from the perspective that I think some of the others on this call might be. So I hope, therefore, my limited interventions are useful from that, which is of a human rights organization and a human rights lawyer who's worked on climate, but trying to understand and work on this space. And I think that's really important because I think we've reached a point, I think most of us are quite aware of that. It's one of the most encouraging things that there's a growing recognition of that within the climate justice, but also other movements, that actually where we are right now, a lot of these issues are extremely cross-cutting in nature. And there is, in fact, one of the dangers we are seeing, one of the reasons we're not making progress is, in fact, a very siloed approach, where we hear at the COP, governments say, well, this is for a discussion in the World Bank Group space. Or at the World Bank Group space, you hear, well, this is a discussion at the UNFCCC space. And actually, the truth is that we can't afford that because the nature of what we're dealing with, particularly when we're looking at anything on finance now, is that the issues are extremely interlinked and we need to be dealing with them far more comprehensively. So I think what I want to capture with this is, I mean, this is sort of, for me, the fundamental flaw in a lot of the discussions that happen, that the discussions on climate finance are isolated from the broader trends of what we are seeing happening right now in the world, but particularly when we look at global financial architecture. And so I like this analogy that I've used before of a pot that basically has a massive hole at the bottom and on the sides, where particularly if we talk about low and middle income countries are essentially just losing revenues at the moment on debt repayment and also to tax abuses. And so there is a huge sum of money being lost to both of these. And at the same time, the focus continues to be on what's the little bit of additionality that we're going to keep getting through largely. And I think I want to pick this up, that the challenge of it, what governments like to talk about as voluntary climate finance commitments. And we can discuss that because there is a question about whether they are actually voluntary or whether they're in fact obligations that states have. But that is, I think, the danger, that without looking at this bigger picture, and I think it's really important when we get into any process like the COP that we don't just stay in that very narrow framework, because of course, any negotiation, the scope gets narrower and narrower, but that we can have that sort of intersectional and broader perspective to bring. Because I think this is the truth of the matter at the moment. The fiscal space that is available, particularly for low and middle income countries, developing countries or global south countries, is extremely limited. And there is very little room for maneuver for them while they continue to lose huge amounts of resources, and actually very little is coming in on the other side. I'm going to just very briefly, I think Frederica's touched all of this. I think I just wanted to say, I mean, obviously, I think one of the challenges at the COP, I'd say from my perspective, which is a little bit more of an outsider perspective, is how finance is discussed. So obviously finance is across different agenda items, but just to sort of flag, I think a couple of things there, picking up from what Frederica said and sort of zooming out a bit. So essentially, obviously, the global stock take has looked at the issue of finance flows. And that is an area where that discussion is going to be happening, and it's going to be quite important. But again, I think it is important to be looking at, while all financial flows need to be aligned and brought into force, I think we have to be careful and sort of notice that distinction between the private and the public, and how often the boundary is blurred on that, and exactly what they are contributing to, which is something like Frederica pointed to, and I suspect others will. On the US 100 billion climate finance goal, Frederica's touched on it, but I've actually prepared just a list of, because I thought we'd have so little time. I tried to prepare a list of resources, trying particularly to pick stuff that is, I think, simpler and more accessible in giving overviews, because I think it's overwhelming when you look at this field. I know many people here are experts who follow this in great depth, but I have to say, from the perspective of most others, it's a really difficult topic to follow, and the technicality becomes almost like a deliberate barrier to others being able to engage with the topic. So I've tried to highlight simple resources where possible. I'll highlight that. But one of them, actually, and I see he's on the call, is Joe Thwaites from Analysis, a Twitter thread, actually, of the weaknesses of the OECD's claim that the 100 billion finance goal has been met. And I think an important point to say, then I'm going to bring it up further in the next slide, is how much of this financing is loan-based. And I think that is really, really important for us to consider, because if you're a developing country right now, you are paying more. Many countries are at the point where they are paying more in just right now on repayment of just interest on climate, on debt, than they are able to pay on entire sectors, education, health, and others, and climate increasingly suffers as a result of that. The other one I just wanted to flag in relation to that, I think, is obviously there is the discussion happening on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It's not going to be agreed at this COP, but I think the discussions at this COP are going to be quite influential in terms of what happens next time. Again, I think the question is, what goes into this? How is it just a question of, I mean, the 100 billion number is, frankly, from a perspective of obligations, and this is, I think, a point I wanted to make. The constant pushback we see, best illustrated in the negotiations on the loss and damage fund from governments who want a voluntary approach, who do not want to acknowledge that they have obligations to be paying financial compensation to countries for loss and damage or reparations, the extremely scary R word, is completely inconsistent with the actual position under international law. So both under international environmental law, in particular the Paris Agreement, but frankly, and for me, more also a very important framework that's being ignored, under international human rights law, these are obligations of states. If we were having this discussion in any other context and the roles were reversed, the damage had been caused by consumption of developing countries, we would be having a very, very different discussion on the legal framework and the obligations of states to be fixing this situation. And I think that is key, that we look at this holistically. So what are some of the things that need to come in that regard? Just to kind of flag these three major buckets, I think, which are quite important. I'm going to spend a bit more time on tax, but the other two are equally important. As I mentioned, obviously, I think we're all aware there is a deepening crisis that is on debt, which is getting worse. And we are in a space, and I think this is why it's important to stop looking at the other space and think the problem is being solved there. We are in a completely, for those who were in Marrakesh, we were in a completely surreal space where the IMF and World Bank is saying, well, it's not as bad as it was in the 1990s, which is frankly quite mind-blowing for anyone who's seeing the impacts of the debt crisis or who wants to try and find any kind of a solution to address the issue. So the solution isn't coming, and the issue of debt cancellation, rather than a little bit of debt tweaking or restructuring, has to be fundamentally on the table and linked up to all the discussions on financing that are happening at the COP. And there, I just wanted to draw your attention to a campaign. There are many campaigns, but just one that I had flagged is a global week of action on debt cancellation, which is by many, many groups working on debt and climate. And the details are available in the resources page for people who haven't seen it. And then very briefly also on IFIs. I mean, we have to be clear. I mean, there was a call there was a decision at the COP, then multilateral development banks and international financial institutions need to be reformed and align their spending with climate goals. I could go on this, but again, there's some resources on that. In very briefly, that is not happening. The response of the World Bank Group to dealing with the problem is to ask for more funds to be given to them, but driving a very strong, was called Cascade, now changed in their evolution roadmap to an approach that is very, very heavily reliant on unlocking private funds, and which does not respond to the issues that we need to see, particularly both in terms of public sector funding and their ability to increase that, but also that the state needs to be driving the agenda when it comes to private sector funding. We can't be trying to seduce the private sector into the space and think that's going to work. And I've included some resources in that. And in that regard, I think there's an important campaign right now by a number of groups calling for new special drawing rights to be on the agenda and a new allocation to be there. And then lastly on tax, because I think I want to come back to that pot, because that's the key issue here. And it's something that's come up in other discussions that we've been doing. So we are, at the moment, countries are losing $480 billion per year on tax abuses, largely linked to profit shifting by companies, as well as tax evasion by individuals. So the money is being lost to tax havens. This is a long-standing problem. There's been a commitment from the OECD and from the G20 to address this problem, and it has not happened. So companies have continued to lose this, and the frameworks that are on the table, there are things that can be taken from them, particularly the OECD framework. They do not go far enough to address the issues. And so we've seen a heroic fight by the African group of states to put this issue front and center at the UN General Assembly to try and get a UN tax convention. And I just want to stress that this is a historic opportunity. It's something people didn't think could happen. And it is something that there is a real engagement here and a need for basically the climate movement to consider engaging with this space, because it can unlock a lot of resources that are currently being lost. And most importantly, it can put the control for those resources right in the hands of developing countries themselves. They don't have to wait for funds to be filled and for the money to be slowly dispersed. They can themselves levy things like progressive digital services taxes to raise much needed revenue at this moment. So I just want to flag that. And I also want to flag that as an area of political tension, because that's where you can see it right away. The countries who are blocking this or creating problems and wanting a weak framework are from the European Union. It's the European Union, it's the UK, it's the US, it's South Africa. South Africa is completely in favor with the African group. South Korea and Turkey were the ones who originally expressed dissension. And we have a vote today that's happening in the next few hours, which will be quite critical. And this comes down again, I think, to if some of these countries continue to push back, we have a risk that essentially a lot of developing countries are saying, you are not walking your talk. You're not following through. You say you want to help, you want to raise revenue, but when there's an opportunity on the table, something that we want, you are not supporting us. And it's going to lead to increased polarization between states. And in that regard, just to flag just a little more detail, I can see colleagues from ECF are here and they'll be able to share more. So there is an international taxation task force, which I understand the hope is will be launched at the COP, which is being supported at the moment. It started from a French-Kenyan initiative, but is also supported now by Barbados, which is going to be looking at, it's a discussion space, as I understand, that is the position that the French have taken. ECF will support the task force. It's going to look at various forms of taxation as new and additional forms of finance to accelerate the discussion, with the idea of having some agreement reached, which could then be fed into different bodies. I think this is a very important initiative, but again, I think at the moment there is a problem if France is one of the countries that needs to show support for what the African group itself is asking for to have credibility in this space. And there was a discussion, very useful discussion at the Paris Peace Forum that people may want to refer to. I think the key issues are going to be with this: what is the role of this space? What political support does it enjoy will be critical to whether it goes ahead or not at the COP. But also ensuring that what's being discussed is I think as Pratika said, additional, but also more important, really grounded in principles of climate justice and equity and principles of tax justice, because that demands that what's being put on the table right now, first of all, it links up to some of the weaknesses in the core tax framework and international rules and fixes that, but is also that the burden of these taxes is not regressive. It's not ending up being borne by again, people, low-income people in developing countries or even in developed countries who are already paying the price for a crisis that they did not create. And I think that is critical. So I think how that's dealt with will be very important. And making sure that the issue agenda is truly comprehensive will also be quite key. And then the last point just to say on that is obviously there are other demands from the climate movement for other forms of taxation, which are also on the agenda instead of polluter pays taxes and others. And there are, I think, calls from some groups, at least some which I've referenced, for some of that to be included in the discussions on the new collective goal. I'll stop there and I'll pass over to my colleagues so that we can have more time.
Excellent. Thank you for that very comprehensive overview and the more detail following from Parike. That's excellent. I want to quickly now move over to, we've heard what the policy priorities are for COP. Now let's talk about what civil society are doing in terms of advocacy campaigns and some messaging for COP. Before I do that, don't forget, and I see that Anja has done so, please put your questions into the chat and we'll turn to those as soon as the presentations are finished. So without further ado, handing over to Sophie Richmond. And Sophie, I think your computer's having some problems with the screen, so you're just going to speak to us.
That's correct. Apologies for the lack of video and the lack of slides, but hopefully you can hear me at least. Yeah, so I was just going to highlight some of the advocacy and campaigning plans that I have involved in or linked into via the Big Shift Coalition and also some wider civil society plans. So obviously the focus of Big Shift is shifting MDB finance out of fossil fuels and into a just energy transition. So there's a couple of pieces around that. We know that Al Jaber, the COP28 president, has called on the MDBs to do better to fix climate finance and has asked them to play a key role in laying the foundation for a new framework on climate finance. We know that the heads of the MDBs are meeting with Al Jaber on the 4th of December for some of those discussions. So as with other members of the Big Shift Coalition, we've got an action planned that morning to highlight the need for the MDBs to clean up their act if they're being considered as a solution to the climate crisis. We want to expose the contradictions and show that we're watching and kind of share that message that if they're still funding the cause of the climate crisis directly and indirectly, they're not really part of the solution. So we'll have that action first thing on that morning with a kind of to-do list for the MDBs. They are also due to give an update on their joint Paris alignment methodology, which was something that they agreed when they committed to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and agreed to work together on a methodology to align all of their operations with the Paris Agreement. So we know that they're giving an update at their shared pavilion, and we'll respond to that along with other civil society members that are there. We'll also make the use of bilateral advocacy meetings because we know at the pavilions, the MDB staff tend to have quite a big presence at the pavilions, usually at COP. And we're also supporting the related actions of other groups. For example, Don't Gas Africa have a couple of actions planned, and there's also a Don't Gas the Global South action in the works. Then we're also focusing specifically on the World Bank as the host of the Loss and Damage Fund. As Frederica mentioned, the focus now is really on filling the Loss and Damage Fund. And from conversations with groups working closely on loss and damage, this isn't, or they're not expecting a reopening of the negotiations, but they are keen to keep pressure on the World Bank developing countries made a concession to have the World Bank as the host of the Loss and Damage Fund. It was something that many of them were opposed to and wanted an independent host. But they also put in place conditions. So they're keen for us to keep that pressure on the World Bank, that it needs to up its game and to ensure it meets expectations of as host. And there's a number of actions planned, both on Finance Day on the 4th of December, around the need to fill the fund, and then also wider actions planned on the 6th of December, which is being decided as Loss and Damage Day. So we'll also have an action then to just call out the fact that more finances to fossil fuels equals more loss and damage. And we've got speakers for that action, including a partner from Pakistan who works on loss and damage and on the World Bank. Then there's various other initiatives that link to the global financial architecture discussions. There's a joint civil society letter that's been put together by a number of different organisations, aiming to pull together recommendations and points of unity from discussions among quite a wide range of groups around public finance. And the letter calls for large-scale public funding of transformative and community-led renewable solutions, with global north countries paying their fair share. It also calls to stop the funding of fossil fuels, and it calls for a democratic overhaul of global financial architecture, including, as Meghna mentioned, how all these pieces come together, so including tax, debt, monetary policy and the IFIs, to allow public money to be fairly and effectively distributed. And that letter is currently circulating for sign-on and will be launched in a press conference on December the 3rd at COP. From the Cannes Finance Working Group, they're also finalising a one-pager on climate finance at COP28, which aims to debunk some of the fake ideas and set the narrative right. And hopefully this can be an advocacy tool on how finance comes in across different parts of the negotiations. A lot of the pieces that Frederica mentioned before as well, adaptation finance, 2.1C on financial architecture, the 100 billion goal, and that resource will kind of bring together some of the key messages and positions around that. There's so many actions planned around the venue. There's a huge choreography of actions by the COP28 coalition, who are also making that link that was highlighted before to human rights, solidarity with Palestine, and climate justice. There's specific actions planned for Finance Day on the 4th, Energy Day on the 5th, Loss and Damage Day on the 6th, and obviously the Global Day of Action on the 9th of December. And these are, and then Cannes has a whole choreography as well around fill the fund, as I mentioned. Also the key demands around fossil fuel phase out and make polluters pay. I think I can leave it there. There's other side events. There's a side event that Cannes and OCI and others have organised on ending fossil fuels, and the opportunities for that at COP, and various others. We have a kind of calendar of the events that are linked to international public finance, which I'm sure can be shared. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully that's kind of an overview of some of the concrete plans. And then obviously there'll still be moving plans and reactive actions and other activities as the negotiations develop as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophie, for that overview. And great if you could share any links to resources, and I'll put them on the events page. Handing over now to Andrew for Glasgow Action Team and what you're busy working on for COP.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Nasdin. I run the Glasgow Actions team. I'm going to do a brief little security checkup for folks traveling to COP, although I would say that these are good security practices to have in mind in general when going to an event like this or traveling for work. As I'm interested in seeing just in the chat, if folks want to just drop in, are they going to Dubai? Are they not going to Dubai? Everyone just go ahead, drop it in the chat. Yes, no, maybe. I will pause there for a second. Okay, slowly coming in. Looks like a lot of yeses. That's great. I'll talk a little bit about security in a moment, but first, just like a quick note on Glasgow Actions team. We exist to make sure that for meetings like UNFCCC meetings and World Bank meetings, that every delegate and decision maker, when they're entering the room, whatever newspaper they look at, whatever Twitter feed they look at that morning, they are hit with the key messages of the climate and climate justice movement, debt justice movements, to make sure they're getting hit with those key messages so that they know where the bar is for the right thing that they need to do. You may have seen some of our work at the Paris Summit, where we wanted to frame the conversation specifically around ending fossil finance and making polluters pay. We usually do big actions on the outside of events that make sure that those newspapers and Twitter feeds are filled with those key messages. As most folks know, actions like this are a little less doable in Dubai. So we're planning on doing a couple things. One is just bringing like an action center. So if anyone is interested in making signs, banners, or things that they can use on the inside, we will have all the materials that you would need. My Twitter handle, and I'll drop my email address in the chat, and I'm sure Kel will share it with folks. If anyone needs support or is interested in support, do reach out. We're here to help. We'll be on the ground. The other thing I will say is we're going to have these cool, well, we can't do a big banner drop out front in front of a big monument beforehand. We are going to have these cool lapel pins. These will be little 1-inch, 1.5 centimeter hard enamel lapel pins that everyone should have on their cool COP finery that we all put on when we walk around conferences like this. We'll have a couple hundred of these. I'm going to have them in little bags of 5. So you should definitely grab one, but you should also let me give you a bag of 5 so that your colleagues can have these key messages on them when they're in all the important meetings with delegates and decision makers that they have during our couple weeks in Dubai. So grabbing a set of these, do grab my Twitter handle, grab my email address. Alex, if you can drop my email address in the chat, just reach out and I will make sure you get a bag of these to hand out to folks. So a note on security. A couple things that we like to do when we're traveling for events like this. I will say rely on your, if your organization has security procedures, these don't supersede them. Talk to your security folks. But good things to do before we travel and once we get on the ground. So in the before we travel department, things I would note are disabling your lock screen notifications and biometric scanning for your devices. We want to make sure that anything that's popping up on your screen is something that you would be comfortable potential security services or other people seeing. I would recommend doing that. Also, if you have that thumbprint opening for your phone, we know that's super convenient, but not terribly great for security. So go ahead and disable that, update to something with at least 13 characters as a password. Make it so that if you put your phone down, the display locks as soon as possible. Sometimes we have it set up so it's like a 10-minute waiting period. We don't want that. And make sure you download any of the apps that are required for your work on the ground before you get there. This is things like WhatsApp and Signal. in terms of encryption, Signal is going to be your better bet always for communication on the ground. I would recommend folks use it for all the work they do in this regard, in this arena. I know we're very used to WhatsApp, but WhatsApp is owned by a multinational corporation that tracks us for our data and harvests all that. So recommend using Signal instead of WhatsApp. Also always going for a paper boarding ticket as opposed to using our phones. Again, I know it's super convenient to be able to use our phones and just scan that when you're hopping on the plane, but we want to be minimizing the amount of time that our phone is unlocked and potentially handed to people who could be affiliated with security services or border crossing agents. Once we're on the ground, a couple communication notes and physical notes. Again, encrypted messaging services are going to be the way that you want to communicate with your colleagues in country or out of country. Find me at any happy hour or side event, and I'm willing to talk your ear off on why everyone should be on Signal as opposed to WhatsApp, but do encourage folks to use that. WhatsApp is great. It is encrypted, but it's like the floor of what we should be using. Definitely encourage folks to hop on Signal. Next, in terms of public Wi-Fi, we just don't want to be using it. Whether you're in an airport, whether you're in wherever you are, public Wi-Fi is very easy for folks to, very easy to be compromised, and we don't want our work compromised. So if you want to be making sure that you have a good SIM card that's not given to you by the UAE government at the border, that allows you to connect to your data and do the work that you want to do without relying on public Wi-Fi. Public Wi-Fi can get compromised very quickly. Always encourage folks to use a virtual private network. Again, this is something that you should download before you get on site and not try and do once you're there. And a note on charging devices. Once we get into country, it can be really easy just to grab that USB cable that we all have and plug it into a computer, a TV, anything that's going to allow us to charge our devices and keep doing the work that we're doing. We don't want to be connecting our phones directly to any machine that is not our computer. You should always be using one of those charging blocks between a wall and your device. If you're plugging your phone directly into something, we've seen this on a lot of public transportation in Europe. There can be chargers just there that you can plug right into. You're plugging your phone and all of its data into whatever system that is. Again, an easy way for your information to be compromised, your devices to be compromised. You should always be, I wish I had one of those charging blocks, I usually do. Always be putting a charging block between your phone and whatever you're plugging into. And last but not least, we all have our notebooks filled with notes from meetings that we've been going to for the last couple of months. Any notes that you have with you are something that could be seen by security services or security services. So I always encourage folks to grab a new notebook when traveling to an event like this, and making sure that any paper notes you're writing are things that you would be comfortable if someone picked them, if you lose your notebook and someone reads it, just being careful about what we're putting down on paper. We at Glasgow Action Team also always share our location with someone out of country, so that if anything was to happen to us, someone that we trust knows where we are. And last but not least, controversial one, but for some countries, our countries offer embassy registration services where you can register with your embassy. I can say for the United States, it's the Trusted Traveler Program, which just has you on file. They don't do anything else with that information. And if anything was to happen to you in the country, it's much easier for them to assist you. That's my quick security checkup. Big thanks to everyone who shared some more on the campaigning context and the different events happening at EdCop. I will say again, if you are interested in pins or need any action support on site or security help, we are here to help. And Cal, I'll throw it back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. Very useful and practical information for those on the ground, and could be in some interesting times. And thank you very much for sharing your email address. You can find on the chat again if you want to get in touch with Andrew and the team at Glasgow Action Team. So heading over now to, last but not least, is to Mir Hassan from GSCC to talk about what are the key messages coming out from that we need to amplify for COP28. And again, time for questions is going to be tight, but if you want to put some questions into the chat, we'll go through as many as we can before we finish on the hour. So Mira, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gil. Recognize we're a bit short in time. I'll try my best to do my time. Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about a few key messages that have emerged out of the various discussions that have happened this year, and from speaking to several partners. I will share the slides. And so what are some of the key themes that emerged and the main messages that we want to convey in our communications on public finance? We know that rich countries have fallen short on their pledges and promises of delivering adequate finance for climate action, which means that trust from developing countries now needs to be earned back. So lack of progress on key financing issues would risk further eroding the trust in developed countries, unless a strong outcome for COP28 is delivered, including by making ambitious commitments to reform the international financial system. This COP also provides a significant window of opportunity to lay the groundwork for a new financial system, which is fair, fit for the challenges of this century, and is centered on the notion that we will not have a way out of the climate crisis unless we all will act together. Further, developed countries must double down on commitments made this year during some of the key moments on the reform of the multilateral institutions and the financial architecture. This cannot be achieved without a serious multilateral discussion about debt reform and restructure. If countries don't have the conditions to access finance equitably from the markets, there can be no progress on scaling up mitigation and adaptation solutions across the world. And developing countries will continue to be left behind. So this is a message that we want to push quite strongly. Further, the two major multilateral institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF, they're mandated to lead global collaboration and are expected to leverage their expertise to support all countries in tackling modern challenges, including the accelerating impacts of climate change. So they really need to step up to this. Global investments in climate action for developing countries need to increase to $2.4 trillion annually by 2030. This is about 2% of the global GDP. Currently, these countries are receiving only a tenth of the required sum. And in order to achieve sustained progress on climate and development goals, world leaders need to triple MDB financing and achieve a five-fold increase in private finance mobilization. Global South countries have called for concrete time-bound action on the proposals to reform the multilateral financial system to make it fair, equitable, and help the countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So what must the COP28 deliver on reforming the financial system? It must set out a bold ambition. So the key players in the multilateral system must set out a transformative and truly inclusive vision to reform the system. We know that institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, which were created 80 years ago under the Bretton Woods system, need to transform to remain fit to tackle the key challenges humankind is currently facing. Generate investment to scale. I spoke about this a little bit, but the gap in climate finance is widening each year and will continue to increase unless there's a dramatic increase in the finance available to developing countries to address climate change. So the investments needed really need to come soon enough. Debt relief and restructuring. Developing countries have to pay much higher interest rates on their debt. We heard from the African leaders during the African Climate Summit, Africa is paying 5 times higher rate on its debt as compared to the others, really hampering their ability to invest in climate action. This is unfair. Debt relief must be an urgent priority for all multilateral discussions. Multilateral institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank, have a key role in pulling low-income, vulnerable countries out of debt distress. Then delivering a vision for the reform of the MDBs and capital increase. So we want to keep pushing on the World Bank and the other MDBs to adopt the recommendations of the capital adequacy framework to unlock nearly $190 billion in additional low-cost financing for developing countries, which could help countries tackle climate challenges. In addition to these key measures, additional shareholder capital for the World Bank and other MDBs is also necessary to ensure that low-cost financing is made available for the most pressing challenges, including to tackle the impacts of climate change. And I think Sophie spoke about this, but we want to stress and reiterate that these institutions also need to be better in addition to being bigger. Shifting public finance out from fossil fuels and into renewable energy is a call that we have repeated over the years and that we will keep stressing on during COP. The World Bank and other MDBs must commit to shifting all of their financing out from fossil fuels and into renewable energy, and IMF as the gatekeeper of the international financial system needs to recognize the key role it plays in the climate discussion. IMF's policies must also encourage a shift out of fossil fuels and regard climate change as an important issue that many developing countries are currently facing. On this, Meghna and Frederic have done a brilliant job speaking about this in detail, but COP must take forward the conversation that started in Paris and establish a roadmap for generating new and innovative ways of financing for climate action. But any taxes must benefit those countries most exposed to climate change, and they need to be just. Further, IMF's special drawing rights, this was also talked about before, they must also be a part of the discussion at COP. There have been calls from developing countries, including from African leaders, for the consideration of a new $650 billion SDRs issuance for the climate crisis, and a fair allocation of these SDRs to all low and middle income countries is a message that we want to push. And then unlocking the flow of investments to finance green transformation in developing countries, which means reducing the cost of capital for developing countries. Currently, the high cost of capital in developing countries, almost 2 to 3 times the cost of capital in developed economies, acts as a deterrent to foreign investment in developing countries, which ultimately hampers their ability to invest in a just transition. So foreign exchange guarantees, which could hedge the currency risk for investors and make investments more favorable and more attractive to foreign investors, is something that that is also part of our messaging. I will stop here. And if you need any support with messaging, we do have teams on the ground who will be talking about, who will have spokespeople at hand. We've got a lot of spokespeople that we work with, so please do reach out if anything comes up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mira. And that takes exactly its time. And I apologize. There was so much information, so much excellent wealth of stuff to share. We have run out of time for questions. But I will say, if anybody has any really concrete questions and stuff they really need to know, please email me. And you can find me my info at What World Strategies or info at What World Assembly. You can find that on the event page. And I will pass it to the right people and they can get back to you. Some really interesting information in the chat and some great links. Federici's link to a doodle poll for oil and windfall profits, and Aline sharing the IRC work as well. So there's a resource page on the event page. I will keep that updated. If people send that through to me, we can use that as a bit of an active place in the lead up to COP. But in the meantime, really thanks to our participants for excellent sharing of information. Thanks to all of you for turning up and listening to those presentations, and wish you everyone well at COP, and we hopefully have a excellent and productive 2 weeks there, and see what happens at the end of it. But just leaving there, and thanks everyone, and good advocacy.